Hello, I'm Zan-Misélel Κουστώ, and welcome to Stories of the Sea. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish galleons overloaded with gold and silver stolen from the New World set sail back to Spain. But the reef-filled waters of the Caribbean and Pacific Oceans were treacherous and ships frequently sank. To this day, their billions of dollars of valuable cargo and priceless artifacts lay at the bottom of the sea. Famous treasure hunters like Tέντι Tάκερ, Mel Fίσερ, and Bil Mάθερς have pursued their lifelong dreams and against tremendous odds located lost treasure ships. They have explored the ocean floor, uncovering gold, silver, and emeralds, including everyday artifacts of people who lived 400 years ago. We'll follow these colorful explorers as they learn how each shipwreck is actually a moment frozen in time. Join us as we search for the treasure of the Spanish Main.
When the Spanish landed in the Americas, they carried a sword in one hand and a cross in the other. It was their lust for gold that pushed them halfway across the world. In their conquest of the New World, they launched military campaigns against the native people, sacking them of their riches. The task of transporting their treasures back to Europe was more difficult than its acquisition. The return trip was a perilous journey. The waters of the New World and Asia were dangerous to navigate. Many ships could not escape violent hurricanes, uncharted reefs and shallow sandbars that sent many to the ocean's bottom. Navigators returning to Spain set course following the Gulf Stream up the Florida Keys. They turned eastward near the island of Bermuda and headed across the Atlantic to Europe. For 200 years, the reefs of Bermuda, which extended as far as 12 miles from the island, have claimed an untold number of ships. Salvage diver Tέντι Tάκερ has been uncovering the remains of Spanish, French, English, and Dutch shipwrecks for more than 50 years.
A lot of the shipwrecks on Bermuda's Reef were caused by the necessity for the old sea captains to use Bermuda as a landmark. They had no means of fixing a longitude that was to progress them along the ocean towards Europe. So they tried to sight Bermuda, and they didn't know how far west or east they were, and they piled up on the rocks before they knew where they are. And that's why we had treasure and all kinds of goodies all over the bottom.
But after 3 centuries of ocean currents, storms, and sea worms, little remains of the 16th and 17th century wooden ships. And any treasure is often hidden beneath tons of sand. The secret is to realize that nature rarely makes anything with straight lines. Coral reefs are made up of irregular shapes. Even after the wood of a ship is rotted away, there are still a few visible clues. One clue is a pile of rocks used as ballast, which fill the holds of the top-heavy Spanish galleons.
And looking down, you see roundish-looking rocks. And that is the most significant giveaway.
A fragment of pottery may be the first clue to a Spanish wreck. The Spanish stored food and water in massive jars. And if ballast stone are located with pottery shards, then the clues point to a 16th or 17th century ship. In 1951, Tέντι Tάκερ and Robert Canton made history when they found a Spanish treasure ship. Their discovery was important because it meant that deep underwater excavation was possible. The Spanish ship the San Pedro sank in 1595 while on a return voyage to Spain from Cartagena, Colombia. Among the spectacular artifacts found was a beautiful gold and emerald cross that had belonged to the Bishop of Lima, Peru.
When I found the San Pedro in 1951, probably the beginning of a new era in treasure hunting. It had gold and it had emeralds and it had the pieces of 8, which were the basis of the American silver dollar, and it had gold chains and gold crosses and gold bars and gold ingots and everything that you read about as a story as a kid in school.
The first thing that usually comes to mind when one thinks about treasure ships is gold, silver, and jewels. But historians find personal artifacts just as interesting. A comb made of silver, a pair of earrings, a small ring, were all used by the people who went down with the ship. They are intimate and revealing clues into how these people lived their lives and met their deaths. The first settlers of Bermuda were the English. They were the survivors of the ship Sea Venture, which wrecked along the island's reef while sailing to Virginia in 1609. Realizing Bermuda was strategically located, the English built a number of forts to secure their claim. The settlers of Bermuda took advantage of the ships that sailed near their island. They often lit fires on hilltops to confuse and lure ships onto the reefs, and then salvage the ship's valuables. It was a business they called racking.
Because the Bermudians had nothing at all here in the sense of metallic or any of the resources you'd have in Europe. They had plenty of fish, plenty of pork, the pigs were here, and tobacco. They didn't even have a pipe to smoke it, and a shipwreck meant the source of pipes. This clay pipe, that's from an English shipwreck of 1658.
Artifacts from the shipwrecks can be seen casually displayed everywhere. Like the wreckers of yesterday, today's salvagers still use the materials they find to good advantage. Grinding stones make a walkway that leads to a brick patio, all recovered from a wreck. Teddy Tucker lives in a beautiful home built from the earnings of his salvage trade. But Tucker is driven by more than personal gain. When he finds belt buckles and buttons, ship's fittings and anchors, they're like a jigsaw puzzle. When pieced together, a picture unfolds.
My philosophy is I've never completely stripped the shipwreck. You leave cannonballs, musket shot, everything that's in large quantities. I just take the things that I don't recognize, ceramics and so forth, and I enjoy identifying them to find all those, where they came from, what national origin, the period, the date, the colors. That's part of the game.
In early September 1622, in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, the Spanish galleon, the Atocha, was loaded for the trip home. Her cargo was largely made up of 40 tons of gold and silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru. There were 265 people on board, families and their servants, merchants and officials, soldiers and priests. The amount of emeralds and other valuables that they smuggled on board is impossible to estimate. On the morning of September 4th, the fleet set sail for Spain. The skies were clear as the Atocha and her sister ship, the Santa Margarita, head due north. On the second day of the voyage, the fleet sailed into a powerful storm. The galleons were battered by a violent hurricane. Badly damaged by fierce winds and huge waves, the ships drifted helplessly onto Florida's reefs. At dawn the next day, hundreds of lives and the Empire's treasure had been claimed by the sea. The Atocha became a legend as treasure hunters searched in vain for her fabulous wealth throughout the centuries. 350 years after the Atocha sank, while working in the archives of Seville, Spain, researcher Eugene Lyon discovered an ancient ship's manifest. The document listed the salvage attempts on the Atocha and the Santa Margarita a few years after the ship sank. Most importantly, the documents mentioned the word Marquesa. Dr. Lyon had chanced upon an important clue. He believed that the Marquesa Keys was the location where the Atocha sank. He contacted his associate, Mel Fίσser, who had also become fascinated by the Atocha legend. Mel Fίσser seemed an unlikely figure to lead the search for the Atocha. A former chicken farmer and dive shop owner, he began his quest for the Atocha in 1969. The following years, he fought legal battles with the state of Florida and the federal government. Even after personal tragedy, he refused to give up his dream of finding the Atocha.
When I started in my search, I thought it was only going to take 6 weeks. I just had no concept whatsoever of how difficult it is to find treasure. It's not all just fun. A lot of times you dig an empty hole, you know. Also, you search back and forth for days without finding anything. But it is very rewarding when you do hit it.
According to survivors' account, the Atocha's final voyage ended when she and the Santa Margarita ran aground during a storm. The ship struck a reef which punched a large hole in her bow. She was dragged across the top of the reef for about 1.5 miles before she sank. With Dr. Lyon's information, Fisher moved his operation to the Marquesa Keys. Here he began his first year of pursuing the Atocha. Searching a huge area of relatively uncharted ocean was a massive undertaking. Months stretched into years. The work was backbreaking, the tedium only outweighed by the drudgery. Along with the search, Fisher fought to maintain his increasingly expensive operation, raising money from investors, mounting debts, battling government lawsuits concerning the ownership of salvage rights were constant obstacles. In June of 1973, 2 dull gray objects with centuries of incrustation were found. But the discovery only added to Fisher's problems. Many believe that Fisher was a con man, a huckster, who planted the 2 silver bars to interest more investors in his salvage operation. Despite his critics, Fisher continued, and sometime later, his son Dirk discovered 9 bronze cannons with inscriptions linking them to the Atocha. Fisher was overjoyed by this new proof, thinking he was finally closing in on the wreck site. His peace of mind was short-lived. Within weeks, Dirk Fisher and his wife Angel led a team to where the cannons had been discovered. During the night, their boat developed a leak. While they slept, the boat filled with water and capsized. Dirk and Angel drowning. Anguish and doubts consumed Fisher. Despite his personal loss, he pushed on. Years would pass before his efforts could again be rewarded. After 10 years, Fisher's crew finally discovered a number of ancient timbers on the sea floor. The divers were able to swim to the bottom and touch the 17th century timbers of a ship that sank 350 years ago. The wreck was the Atocha's sister ship, the Santa Margarita. By the summer of 1982, Fisher had recovered more than $20 million worth of treasure. But even this incredible success did not steer Fisher from his original goal of finding the Atocha. In 1985, 16 years from when he first began his search, a sonar located the Atocha. It was a bittersweet find for Mel Fisher and his family, because it was also 10 years to the day that his son and daughter-in-law had died when their boat sank. The next day, his divers followed up on the sonar scan. Searching the ocean bottom, they came across what at first looked like a small reef. As they moved closer, they realized that the reef was made up of ballast stones and stacks of gray bars. After years of hard work, frustration, and personal loss, Mel Fisher and his crew could finally rejoice. His divers had found the mother lode. The silver and gold stacks they recovered were worth more than $400 million. Ironically, just 2 weeks before the site was found, Fisher could barely make his payroll. As the excavation continued, it was personal artifacts that grabbed the most attention. They were much more beautiful than the hundreds of dull silver bars. And with these artifacts, details about the passengers began to emerge. Long gold chains like these were often worn on the ship by the wealthy on their way back to Spain. They often hid their wealth by wrapping the chains tightly around their bodies. But on this journey, their gold became the instrument of their death. The heavy chains dragged them to the bottom of the sea. A key member of Fisher's team was marine archaeologist Duncan Matheson. He and his team cataloged, examined, and recorded every pottery shard, every coin, cannon, artifact, and remnant recovered from the shipwreck.
While working with the divers out on the boats, I quickly realized that we had to collect archaeological data, information that would tell us where the ship came in from. And by collecting data, we realized very quickly that the artifacts were telling us to go out into the deep water.
The ship apparently came in from the southeast to the northwest, and it hit a reef southeast of Marquesas, and then the bottom part of the vessel broke out, losing the bulk of the silver bars and silver coins and gold bars and things.
Well, you know, most of the things that you read in the papers and you see on TV, you'll see gold and silver coming up off of these wreck sites, and you don't really get an idea of what we actually do here. After we bring up the glitter and the gold, we have an enormous amount of archaeological material that has to be processed, and that's what this is really all about. We're trying to look back into the past to see what the living strategies were there, what their technology was like, and by and large, this is the way that we do it.
A lot of folks think that most treasure hunters are really in the game for the silver and the gold. But after the find on the main pile of the Atocha, I mean, there were nearly 40 tons of silver bars there. Let's face it, it's real fun bringing up the first couple of silver bars, but after that it's just heavy bullion and it's a lot of work. We got a lot more excited about finding personal artifacts, things that we could identify with the passengers, examining the wood, looking for defects or craftsmanship in the actual hull timbers that we found. All of the little things from everyday life, that's what really made the find. And let's face it, you know, the pottery is just as old as the silver is, and in a lot of ways a lot more interesting to look at.
Well, this is my hobby. It's a very exciting hobby. Fun, romance, and adventure, you know, and I enjoy it.
Mel will probably be always known as the greatest treasure hunter the world has ever seen, but I like to think of him as a teacher.
It takes some people like Mel, dreamers, to kind of put their flavor into this world. Because even though, yeah, sure, he's a dreamer, but he's got his head in one place and he knows where he's going and he knows what he's looking for.
The Spanish Empire was not limited to the Americas. Their influence extended into the Pacific Ocean and Asia as well. The largest ships in the Spanish fleet were known as the Manila galleons. These ships were the supertankers of their time, carrying their trading goods from the Far East to Mexico. Many of these ships disappeared during their voyages without a trace. Bill Mάθher's, like Tucker and Fisher, was another seafarer who always dreamed of finding an ancient shipwreck.
Well, I guess I've been interested in the water, ships and shipwrecks ever since I was very young. However, it wasn't until 1969, when I went out to the Far East, that I actually started to learn a little bit more about the Manila galleon trade. It was that time, when I was working in the Philippines with the Navy, that I determined that someday I would try and track down a Manila galleon and salvage it. However, it was a number of years, 16 years to be exact, before I really had the opportunity to do anything about that dream.
Manila was established as a trading center, handling the exchange of gold and silver from the New World, as well as spices and other products from China, Japan, Thailand, India, and Vietnam. The galleons were loaded with products from the Orient and sailed east to Mexico and to the port of Acapulco. The 6-month voyage was difficult and dangerous. Once the ships arrived in Mexico, the premium goods were traded for silver coins and ingots. To investigate the Manila galleon trade, Máther's hired 2 maritime historians to examine Spanish archives. They learned that during the 250 years of Spanish trade in the Far East, there were at least 44 recorded ships that had sank near the Philippines and the Mariana Islands. The Manila galleons, like the Nuestra Señora de la Concepcion, were unique in their size. They were nearly 150 feet long and 50 feet wide, and could carry up to 1,500 tons of cargo. And they still had room left to accommodate over 300 passengers and crew.
The Manila galleons were much larger by a factor of 2 or 3 than the galleons sailing in the Atlantic. And that's primarily because they didn't have such a dangerous navigational route, and they didn't have to face the pirates and the navies that they had to in the Caribbean.
Based on his research, Máther's determined that the Concepcion was one of the most likely of the 44 missing ships to be found. Lost off the coast of Saipan on September 20th, 1638, most of her passengers and crew never made it to shore.
The sailors and the passengers started fighting. Many were killed or wounded. And during the fighting, apparently the ship broached, turned sideways to the wind when it was not attended properly, and all this masts were broken off. Then the ship apparently was pushed westward to Saipan, and in trying to find a safe anchorage around Saipan, they got a little close to the reef.
Records show that the Spanish returned 4 decades later and salvaged the Concepcion's bronze cannons and anchors. But for the next 3.5 centuries, the Concepcion and her treasure rested on the ocean bottom. In 1987, Bil Mάθher's established Pacific Sea Resources and negotiated a contract with the government of the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas to excavate the wreck. Máther's searched the beaches along the reef where the ship was suspected of breaking up.
First evidence that I discovered was small bits of blue and white porcelain washing around in the wave line. And once I discovered my first piece, there were literally dozens of pieces all over the place.
The porcelain was identified as Ming export ware, similar to porcelain the Concepcion would have carried. This was the first clue to the Concepcion's location. In the spring of 1987, Máther's set up his operation along the beach and began searching for the wreck site. On the second day of field work, his divers discovered a ship's anchor. Comparing the size and shape with those from galleons of the same era, the anchor fit exactly the dimensions that the Concepcion would have carried.
As we carried out our survey, we got further and further away from the shore. We kept finding evidence of the wreck in the form of ballast stones, shards of storage jars. We found a 10-foot-long keel bolt. We found other ship spikes, things of that sort. And then the seabed takes a fairly dramatic fall off from 150 to about 200, 300 feet. On that slope, we found another 30 complete storage jars.
Once the jars were cleaned, a variety of Spanish and Chinese markings indicated the contents, the ownership, and sometimes even the maker of the jars. Some held vinegar, sulfur, saltpeter, and other materials. But the primary function was to hold drinking water and probably large quantities of wine. For Máther's and his crew, such a large concentration of unbroken storage jars indicated that a significant part of the wreck was possibly still nearby. The work was often tedious and boring, sifting sediment, exposing bedrock, poking beneath coral ledges, and carefully chipping at the coral to uncover encrusted artifacts.
These projects are very exciting because, you know, for that example, nobody's ever found one of these Manila galleons before, so we're breaking new territory. But, you know, this is a beautiful environment in which to work. You have waters that have, you know, 200-foot visibility, beautiful marine life, and that's around you all the time. Every time you go on a dive, there's a possibility you could find something absolutely spectacular, which is very exciting.
Over the course of the second season of excavation, the crew of Pacific Sea Resources began to find artifacts with the unmistakable luster of gold. Over 2,500 pieces of gold jewelry were recovered.
Yeah, the gold that we found so far represents gold from what is generally considered the height of Chinese metalworking, the Chinese metalworking period, which was the middle of the 1600s. And this is exquisite work of gold jewelry, and it's the Sotheby appraiser looked at it and he said that this stuff has never come on the market before.
During the 17th century, old jewelry was often melted down, then redesigned into the current styles and fashions of the time. Therefore, the discovery of a piece of 16th century jewelry is a rare find and incredibly interesting to historians. One such example is a piece appropriately labeled the pyramid chain. Another example of this lost art and craftsmanship is this tiny gold shoe that may have carried perfume, encrusted with 44 inlaid diamonds. Ornate rings, brooches with precious stones, crucifixes are all unique, with no other similar known pieces that survive today. After 4 years of field work and study, Máther's and his team have concluded that the Concepcion broke up along the reef. Unfortunately, the native Chanuro Indians and the Spanish were able to salvage most of the treasure of gold and silver. But for Máther's, the project has still been a great success. His team has developed the technology needed for deep-sea salvage. The information learned from the Concepcion will help in locating future galleon wrecks.
Where do we go from here? Well, we've decided to take it a step further, and we're going into deep water, where we hope to find historic shipwrecks that are undisturbed by salvage or the elements.
The Atocha, the Concepcions, and other shipwrecks have given us more than great riches of silver and gold. They are a precious time capsule containing priceless archaeological information and historical insights into the lives of people long gone. Of course, the true heroes are the remarkable men who, in the face of adversity, persevere to find and recover the lost treasures of the sea. Their stories are a tribute to the human spirit. They are people with a vision, a drive, a quality almost as rare as the treasure they find. I'm Zan-Misélel Κουστώ. This is Stories of the Sea.